All right, let's just dive right into one of history's greatest mysteries. For most of our existence, humans were wanderers, hunter-gatherers. But then, something happened in the Near East, something that would completely change the game and send this massive wave of change across an entire continent. This is the incredible story of how farming conquered Europe.
I mean, really think about that for a second. For hundreds of thousands of years, human life is basically the same. You follow the herds, you gather the plants. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, people in the Fertile Crescent start planting seeds and raising animals. But the crazy part is, it doesn't stay there. It spreads like wildfire. So the question that puzzled archaeologists for a century was, how? Was it just a really good idea that went viral? Or was it something else entirely, a mass movement of people?
And just look at the scale of this thing. It's like a wave of change moving steadily west. It starts in the Near East, hits the shores of Greece and the Balkans around 7000 BCE, and then just keeps washing across the continent for the next 3,000 years until it reaches the Atlantic. The speed is just staggering when you think about it. So how did the first scientists even begin to tackle this puzzle?
Well, you have to remember, they worked with what they had. And what they had were the things that last, the durable, physical evidence left behind. We're talking pots, tools, and stones.
So brilliant people, like the famous archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, they started mapping it all out. And they saw a trail. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs. A certain style of pottery would pop up in Greece. And then, a few hundred years later, a nearly identical style shows up in Italy, and then further west. The logical conclusion? Well, the people who made those pots must have moved, right?
And that led to this huge debate that pretty much defined the field for decades. On one side, you had the migration model. The idea was that waves of actual farmers physically moved, settled new lands, and basically replaced the local hunter-gatherers. But on the other side, you had the ideas model. Maybe the local hunter-gatherers just saw their neighbors farming, thought, hey, that looks like a pretty good deal, and adopted the technology themselves, without many people actually moving at all.
And for the longest time, there was just no way to know for sure. I mean, think about it. A pot can't tell you the DNA of the person who made it. Was it carried hundreds of miles by a migrant farmer? Or was it just a local knockoff, made by a hunter-gatherer who was trying out a hot new trend? The artifacts were silent on the biggest question of all. The debate was totally deadlocked.
But then in the 21st century, a completely new kind of evidence burst onto the scene, something that could speak to us directly from the people of the past. It was a total game changer.
And that game changer was ancient DNA. This technology is basically a time machine. For the very first time, scientists could pull tiny fragments of genetic code from skeletons that were thousands and thousands of years old. Finally, they could stop guessing based on pots and start analyzing the actual people themselves, reading their ancestral fingerprints.
So this was the moment of truth. What would the DNA show? If the ideas theory was right, then Europe's first farmers would just be the direct descendants of the local hunter-gatherers. But if the migration theory was right, well, their DNA would look completely different.
And the answer when it came was just incredibly clear. There was no ambiguity. It was the smoking gun. The DNA showed that Europe's first farmers were not the descendants of the local hunter-gatherers, not even close. They were a genetically distinct population. And when scientists asked, okay, so who are they related to, they found a perfect match. The early Neolithic people from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. The data from one study after another was just overwhelming. As one major paper put it, the great majority of the ancestry of the first European farmers was derived from Anatolia. This wasn't just a hint or a whisper of a connection. It was a loud, clear, direct genetic line stretching all the way back.
And just like that, the decades-long debate was over. The verdict was in. It wasn't just an idea that spread across Europe. It was a mass movement of people who carried that idea with them. But you know how science works. Answering one huge question just opens up a whole new set of maybe even more interesting questions.
Because now that we knew what happened, the really fascinating part became figuring out how exactly it all went down. This wasn't just about a simple answer anymore. It was about the story. And what the genetics revealed was a much richer, more complicated picture than just some kind of massive invasion. This was a messy, human story that unfolded over hundreds of generations, one village, one family at a time. It's really a story of pioneers pushing into a new frontier.
So, the new model that emerged is often called leapfrog colonization.
See, these small pioneer groups didn't just walk in a straight line. They often traveled by sea, hopping along the Mediterranean coast, skipping over huge territories to find the absolute best spots to set up a farm. Then, once they'd established these little hubs, their populations would grow and start to fill in the areas around them. And crucially, on the edges of this expanding world, they finally met the locals.
And this part is so important. The local hunter-gatherers weren't just wiped out or pushed off a cliff. They were, over time, absorbed. So if you look at the genetic profile of a typical European farmer a few centuries after their arrival in a region, you'll see that, yeah, they're overwhelmingly descended from those Anatolian newcomers. But there's also a significant chunk, maybe 20% of local hunter-gatherer DNA mixed right in.
And what's absolutely fascinating is that this mixing wasn't a one-time thing. The data clearly shows that the percentage of hunter-gatherer DNA in these farming populations actually increased over time. So right at the beginning, there was very little mixing. It was slow. But as generations passed, the two groups interacted more and more, creating these new, blended societies right there on the frontier.
So when you put it all together, the old evidence from the pots and tools and this revolutionary new evidence from DNA, it all points back to one critical region that acted as the launchpad for this new European world. Anatolia. It was the bridge. All the incredible innovations of the Neolithic revolution that sparked in the Fertile Crescent, they were channeled through Anatolia. It's where this new way of life was perfected, adapted, and then launched out into Europe.
And these migrants didn't just bring one or two new tricks. They brought an entire toolkit for a new way of life, something archaeologists call the Neolithic package. It was the whole shebang. Domesticated plants like wheat and barley, domesticated animals like sheep and goats, the technology to make pottery and polish stone tools, and the revolutionary idea of living in one place in a permanent village.
And here's the kicker. It only took about 2,000 years. Now that might sound like a long time, but in the grand arc of human history, that is a blink of an eye. In just 2,000 years, this new lifestyle, carried by these pioneers from Anatolia, had completely remade a continent from top to bottom.
What this incredible scientific discovery really shows us is that the story of humanity is the story of movement. Migration isn't some modern thing. It has been a fundamental engine of change and innovation for thousands and thousands of years.
We've completely moved away from that old, static picture of the past where you had these isolated cultures that never interacted. Thanks to science like ancient DNA, we now see a far more dynamic, messy, and frankly more interesting ancient world, one where people were constantly on the move.
It's a really powerful thing to wrap your head around, isn't it? The very foundations of so much of the modern world were laid not by people who had always been there, but by newcomers who brought a revolutionary new way of life with them. So the thought I want to leave you with is this. If our ancient world was so fundamentally built by migration, what does that tell us about our world today?